Good evening, family. This is Pastor Kirby, and we thank you for coming to St. James Word to Go with Bible Study. This is the day that the Lord has made, and we want to just thank God for another opportunity to come before you. Again, my name is Pastor Kirby Newsom, the pastor of St. James African Methodist Episcopal Church here in the great city of Warren, Arkansas, and also the great city of Rising, Arkansas, where that church is named St. James AME Church in Rising, Arkansas. Let's dig into this Bible study this evening, coming from Exodus, the 17th chapter, verses 1 through 17. Exodus, the 17th chapter, verses 1 through 17. And basically, I'll be reading from the Revised Standard Version. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore, the people found fault with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you find fault with me? Why do you put the Lord to proof?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" Fam, that's the first three verses of Exodus 17. When you get a chance, read the rest of that passage of scripture when you have an opportunity. Let's look at this water in the wilderness, learning to trust the rock. And St. James, let me say this: sometimes the hardest place in life are not the places where we think God has abandoned us. There are places where God is teaching us how to trust him. And the story before us today shows us a thirsty people, a frustrated leader, and a miracle that teaches us a deep spiritual truth. God can bring life from places that look the driest. Let's look at this. The Bible tells us, first of all, the wilderness tests our faith. That's the first thing. Israelites travel according to the commandment of the Lord, yet when they arrived at Rephidim, there was no water to drink. And this is important. They were exactly where God told them to be, yet they were still facing hardship. That challenges a common misconception many believers have. And see, we sometimes think that if we're following God faithfully, life should always be just smooth, easy. But scripture shows us something different, but not destroyed. Israel had already seen incredible miracles. God has sent plagues against Egypt. God had parted the Red Sea. God provided manna from heaven. Yet, when thirst came, they quickly forgot those previous provisions. And so instead of praying, they started complaining. They said to Moses, "Why do you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Their problem was not simply thirst. Their problem was it was spiritual forgetfulness. And see, the lesson here, fam, is when difficult seasons come, we must remember what God has already done in our life. Faith grows when we remember past faithfulness. And so why do people often forget God's past blessings during difficult seasons? And what we need to understand here, and we ask ourselves a question: what is a moment in our lives where God provided when it looked impossible? Well, let's press. The second thing we need to understand is that God provides from unexpected places. Moses cried out. He cried out to God, "What shall I do with these people?" And God responds with a very unusual instruction. He tells Moses to take the staff, the same staff he used during the miracles in Egypt, and strike a rock at Horeb. I need you to think about that. Water normally comes from wells, rivers, and springs. But God tells Moses to strike a rock. In other words, God chooses the least likely place for provision. And why does he do this? Because when the miracle happens, no one can take credit except God. When Moses obeys and strikes the rock, water begins flowing out enough to sustain the whole community. thought it teaches us something powerful about God's character. God is not limited by the environment. He can provide in dry places, in closed doors, and unexpected people, in unlikely circumstances. And sometimes that very place that looks barren becomes the place where God performs his greatest miracle. Come here, New Testament. The Apostle Paul later reflected on this event in the 1 Corinthians 10:4, saying, they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. That rock was Christ. Paul revealed that the rock in the wilderness pointed forward to Jesus. And just as water flowed from the rock to sustain Israel, spiritual life flows from Christ to sustain believers. And so why do you think God sometimes uses unexpected sources to meet our needs? And we need to ask ourselves a question also. Have you ever experienced provision from an unexpected place? So here we are. God tested us in the wilderness for faith. He provides in unexpected places. And then here it is, testing God versus trusting God. See, after the miracle, Moses named the place Massah and Meribah. These names, Massah, testing, which means testing, and Meribah, which means quarreling. The people had questioned, is the Lord among us or not? And see, their circumstances made them doubt God's presence. And this is a struggle believers still face today, saints of God. When life becomes difficult, it's easy to wonder, is God still working? Has God forgotten me? But see, Scripture reminds us repeatedly that God's presence is not dependent on our circumstances. God was present when the sea parted. God was present when manna fell, and God was present when the people was thirsty. And see, what we need to understand is sometimes God's provision arrives after the test of faith. Jesus and the living water. In this, Jesus makes a powerful statement in the Gospel of John 7:37. And he said, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. And then Jesus presents himself as the ultimate source of spiritual life. See, physical thirst in the wilderness pointed to a deeper truth. And see, we as human beings have a spiritual thirst that only God can satisfy. See, people try to satisfy their thirst through many things, success, wealth, recognition, but none of those ultimately satisfies us. And so Christ offers us something different, living water. And see, what we need to understand is we need to ask ourselves a question, why does spiritual thirst look like in our lives now, in these times, in these modern times? And we also need to ask, why do people often look for satisfaction in places that cannot truly fulfill them? See, hard seasons do not mean God has abandoned us. Sometimes the wilderness is part of God's training grounds, a training process. And God often provides through those unexpected means. Saints of God, I stop by this evening to tell you, his power is not limited by circumstances. Christ is the ultimate source of spiritual life. Just as water flowed from the rock, spiritual life flows from Jesus. So here it is. This story in Exodus 17 reminds us that even when life feels dry, God is still present. The same God who provided water in the wilderness continues to provide for his people today. And so here's the invitation as I get ready to close. If we are thirsty for purpose, peace, forgiveness, or hope, you ought to invite or be invited to come to him. And as the promise of the scriptures that when we come to Christ, the source of living water, we will find the life that truly satisfies. Saints of God, we need to understand this. We need to understand that the water in the wilderness is testing us how to trust God and trust the rock. God bless you. May God keep you. This is our prayer. Pastor Kurbe out.